You've been told the end of slavery was a sunrise, chains breaking, voices singing, a nation redeemed. That's the lie. The truth is colder. Freedom didn't come like a sunrise. It came like a knock at midnight, where the messenger might be your savior or your executioner. Men woke to whispers, not fanfare. Women stood in the fields, hands still bleeding from cotton, staring at strangers in blue coats announcing a freedom that felt like a trick. The ink on Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had been dry for 2 years before it touched their ears. 2 years of stolen labor. 2 years of silence. Why? Because information is the first chain any master controls. Slaveholders didn't just own bodies. They owned the timeline of reality. You can't fight for what you don't know you have. So freedom was delayed, rationed like water in a desert. And when it finally arrived, it came with instructions. Stay on the land, work for wages, remain quiet. Understand this. Power does not vanish when a law changes. It mutates. The plantation gates swung open, but the path beyond them was lined with debt, danger, and the invisible ropes of dependency. This wasn't liberation. It was rebranding. The same men who once owned people now owned their labor contracts. The same men who could whip without trial could now starve without guilt. The war had been won on paper, but the battlefield was now the mind, and those who walked out into the unknown were stepping straight into another system built to contain them. The first lie of freedom is that it happens in a single moment. The truth? Freedom is announced like a gift, but delivered like a bargain. Imagine standing barefoot in the dirt, hearing the words, "You are free." Your first instinct is to run. But where? The world beyond the plantation was not built for you. It was built to keep you out. Roads were dangerous. Towns were hostile. Food was scarce. Every mile away from the master's land was a mile into uncertainty. And uncertainty is where fear thrives. Many stayed, not because they loved their chains, but because they could not see the path forward. Masters exploited this fear, presenting themselves as employers rather than owners. Wages were promised, but prices were manipulated. Debt was inevitable. Contracts became invisible shackles. And for those who dared leave, bounty hunters still roamed, not for escaped slaves, but for vagrants who couldn't prove they had work. Laws were rewritten overnight to criminalize freedom itself. You see, emancipation was not a clean break. It was a negotiation staged in the shadows. The North claimed victory. The South claimed resilience. And the freed man was caught in the middle, used as a pawn in the reconstruction of power. Every choice, to stay, to go, to fight, to hide, carried a cost. Freedom demanded not only courage, but strategy, and most had been denied the tools to play this new game. This is why history sanitizes the story. The clean version is inspiring. The real version is unsettling. The truth is that the moment of freedom was less like stepping into sunlight and more like stepping onto thin ice, hearing it crack beneath your feet. The real question wasn't, "Are you free?" The question was, how long before the system finds a new way to claim you? The day General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas in June 1865, history says he brought freedom. What he really brought was an announcement. Words. And words without enforcement are wind. His General Order No. 3 declared all slaves free, but also advised them to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. This was not an invitation to independence. It was a command to transform slavery into labor contracts under the same roofs, for the same men, under the same watchful eyes. Think about it. The army did not escort each freed person to new land, did not provide homes, did not supply the tools of survival. They left them where they stood, in the shadow of their former masters. That was by design. Power understands that chaos benefits the established order. By keeping the freed in place, the plantation economy could be preserved under a new name. And for the owners, nothing truly changed except the paperwork. The law now said, "Employer, instead of master, wages instead of whip. But the imbalance of power remained absolute. Those who left faced starvation, violence, and the constant threat of being dragged back, not as slaves, but as criminals under vagrancy laws. The Emancipation Proclamation freed people on paper. Reality kept them in place. And while the North congratulated itself, the South adapted, faster than anyone imagined. That's the part they don't teach you. Freedom without resources is a trap. The system knew this. That's why they gave the people their liberty and their dependency in the same breath. Freedom without land is like a bird without wings. The men who crafted emancipation knew this. They broke the chains, but kept the soil under lock and key. The vast plantations of the South remained in the same hands, the hands of those who had profited from human bondage for generations. Freedmen were told they could rent plots, but the rent was set so high, it swallowed every penny of their labor. Sharecropping became the new cage. You worked the land, but never owned it. The cotton you picked paid the debt you owed, a debt that never seemed to vanish. This was not an accident. It was a design. Owning nothing meant depending on those who once owned you. Every tool, every seed, every mule, borrowed, tallied, and charged against your future. And the future always came with interest. The political North spoke of rebuilding the nation. But rebuilding for whom? The South rebuilt itself by binding freedmen to the same fields with invisible chains made of contracts, credit, and law. And when resistance grew, violence followed. Night riders in hoods enforced the natural order after dark, burning crops, terrorizing families, reminding the newly freed that land was not theirs to claim. Without ownership, freedom was fragile, always one bad harvest away from ruin. The master's house was no longer your prison, but his land still was. And every acre denied was another mile in the wilderness you were expected to survive without a map. This was the hidden truth. Emancipation was engineered to keep wealth where it had always been, and to keep freedom dependent on permission. The moment a master loses his legal claim over you, he searches for another way to hold you. After 1865, that way was the law. Across the South, black codes emerged. Local ordinances that turned freedom into a legal minefield. Without steady work, you could be arrested for vagrancy. Without proof of employment, you could be fined. And if you couldn't pay, you'd be leased out to work for the state. Convict leasing became slavery by another name, with chains replaced by iron bars and court sentences. In some counties, the jails were nothing but way stations for labor auctions. The same plantations that had been worked by slaves were now worked by prisoners in striped uniforms, guarded by the same men who once carried whips. The law had simply changed the paperwork, and the public was told it was justice, not bondage. But you must understand, law is not morality. Law is the weapon of those who write it. In the hands of the planter class, it was sharper than any lash. Freedmen who sought better wages elsewhere were arrested for breaking labor contracts. Those who tried to hunt, fish, or gather food outside the plantation could be charged with trespass. In every courtroom, the judge's bench was another plantation porch, and justice bent toward property, not people. This is why the North's victory was incomplete. A nation that abolishes slavery on paper but allows laws to cage the same bodies has not freed anyone. It has only renamed the crime. And those names still echo in courtrooms today. The plantation wasn't just a field. It was a mind. Slavery had taught generations that obedience was survival. And that lesson didn't vanish with a proclamation. The first days of freedom were filled with hesitation. Some elders warned the young not to leave too quickly, fearing reprisals. Others whispered that freedom itself might be a trick, a trap to flush them out and punish them. Masters exploited this psychology, speaking softly, offering wages, promising protection from the outside world. And for those born and raised within those fences, the outside world was foreign soil. The very idea of independence was terrifying when you had been taught that every decision, what to eat, where to sleep, when to work, came from someone else. This was the invisible victory of the old order. Even when the chains fell, many minds were still locked. True freedom required unlearning, and unlearning takes time. But time was a luxury the newly freed did not have. Every day without income was a day closer to hunger. Every refusal to sign a contract was another mark against you in the eyes of the law. The masters knew they could not win by force alone. They had to win in the minds of those they once owned. And they did. By turning freedom into a choice between two cages, stay and be paid pennies under familiar tyranny, or leave and starve in an unfamiliar wilderness. This was not freedom as you understand it. This was freedom as defined by those who feared it. Information was power, and the masters hoarded it like gold. Many enslaved people did not hear of the Emancipation Proclamation until months, sometimes years, after it was issued. News traveled slowly when the ones in control kept it chained. Some masters forbade reading outright, making literacy a punishable crime. Why? Because a man who cannot read the law cannot use it to defend himself. A man who cannot read a map cannot escape with certainty. The ignorance imposed during slavery was not accidental. It was infrastructure. After emancipation, that ignorance was maintained through neglect. Schools for freedmen were attacked, teachers threatened or killed, books burned. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to build a bridge toward education, but in many places, the bridge was under constant fire. Every letter learned was an act of rebellion. Every lesson taught was a seed of independence. But those seeds were planted in soil constantly salted by those who feared their growth. Understand this. The delay in freedom was not just a matter of distance. It was a strategy. The longer a man remains unaware of his rights, the longer he remains bound. And even when the truth arrived, it was often wrapped in deception. You are free, but you must still work here. You are free, but you owe me rent. You are free, but you cannot leave without my permission. These were not misunderstandings. They were deliberate manipulations. Freedom announced is nothing without the knowledge to defend it. And knowledge was the one crop the masters never wanted harvested. Freedom is fragile when hunger knocks. The newly freed learned this quickly. Without savings, without land, and with hostile markets, survival often meant accepting whatever work was offered. And the offers came from the same men who once owned them. Wages were often paid in scrip, a form of credit only redeemable at plantation stores, where prices were inflated beyond reason. A pound of flour could cost a day's labor. A simple shirt could take a week's wages. This system kept freedmen in a state of permanent debt. Even if you worked from sunrise to midnight, your account balance often ended lower than it began. This was the economic trap, not enforced by whips, but by ledgers. And the law recognized those ledgers as binding contracts. If you left before your debt was paid, you could be arrested. It was a perfect circle. You owed money because you worked, and you worked because you owed money. Any attempt to break free was branded as theft or vagrancy. Meanwhile, white laborers were offered higher pay for the same work, reinforcing divisions and sowing resentment between the poor, instead of against the rich. This is the bitter truth. Emancipation did not dismantle the plantation economy. It simply reshaped it into a new system where money replaced chains and poverty replaced shackles. The fields still yielded cotton, the masters still grew rich, and the laborers, free in name, still bent their backs beneath the sun. Hunger doesn't care about legal definitions of freedom. And neither did the men who controlled the food. Violence did not vanish with emancipation. It simply changed its uniform. The Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary groups rose from the ashes of defeat, determined to restore white supremacy by any means necessary. Freedmen who dared to vote, own property, or assert their rights were targeted with terror. Homes were burned in the night. Churches, the heart of black communities, were set aflame. Men were dragged from their beds and beaten, sometimes killed, as warnings to others. This was more than random cruelty. It was political strategy. Terror was used to influence elections, drive black leaders into hiding, and keep the freed population submissive. In many counties, local sheriffs and judges turned a blind eye if they were not openly complicit. Militias claimed to restore order while enforcing the old racial hierarchy through lynchings and mob rule. Northern troops stationed in the South tried to stem the violence, but as Reconstruction waned, those troops were withdrawn. Once federal protection was gone, the Night Riders had free rein. For the newly freed, the message was clear. The law would not protect you. Freedom came with a price, and sometimes that price was your life. Violence became the shadow that followed every step forward, ensuring progress was slow, cautious, and fraught with fear. The real victory of these groups was psychological, to make the newly freed doubt whether freedom was worth the risk. And in some towns, that fear was so deep, it would take generations to fade. Politics after emancipation was a battlefield disguised as a ballot box. For a brief moment, freedmen voted in large numbers, electing black representatives and shaping new laws. But the backlash was swift. White politicians, unable to win through open persuasion, turned to voter suppression. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and understanding clauses were crafted to appear neutral, but were designed specifically to disenfranchise black voters. Literacy tests could include absurd questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Questions with no right answer, used only to deny the ballot. Poll taxes required payment long before Election Day, knowing most freedmen could not spare the money. And if these measures failed, intimidation filled the gap. Election days often brought armed white mobs to polling places, blocking access with threats and violence. This was not democracy, it was the illusion of it. The North, weary of Southern resistance, often looked the other way, prioritizing national unity over justice. By the end of Reconstruction, black political power had been almost entirely dismantled in many states. The men who once fought for their own freedom now found themselves voiceless in the very system they had helped to preserve with their labor and their blood. This is the quiet cruelty of post-emancipation America. You are told you are free, but stripped of the tools to shape your future. And when you protest, you are told it's your own fault. Freedom was never meant to be self-sustaining for the newly emancipated. It was meant to be conditional. Land ownership, the cornerstone of real independence, was systematically denied. 40 acres and a mule, the promise whispered in the camps of the freedmen, was rescinded before it could take root. President Andrew Johnson ordered the return of confiscated Confederate land to its former owners, erasing the only tangible opportunity for self-reliance. Without land, freedmen were forced into tenancy on the very soil they had once tilled in bondage. Tenant farming might have looked like independence on paper, but it was another cycle of dependency. Tools, seeds, and shelter were borrowed from landlords, with repayment taken in crops, often leaving the farmer with nothing after debts were settled. This land denial wasn't an accident. It was strategy. Owning land means stability, leverage, and the ability to pass wealth to the next generation. By keeping land in white hands, the old power structure preserved its dominance without the legal chains of slavery. The countryside became a checkerboard of plantations, now dotted with shacks where free families lived under the watchful eyes of the same overseers, now called managers. The dream of autonomy withered in soil they could never truly claim. Even education, the supposed great equalizer, became another battlefield. Freedmen's schools, often funded and run by the Freedmen's Bureau or Northern missionaries, were attacked, burned, and sometimes destroyed with the students still inside. Teachers, many of them women who had traveled from the North, faced death threats and violence simply for teaching basic literacy. Why such fear of education? Because literacy is the key to contracts, ballots, and the ability to see through lies. An illiterate population can be manipulated indefinitely. An educated one becomes dangerous to those in power. In rural areas, white landowners openly discouraged schooling, claiming that educated Negroes won't work the fields. Laws were quietly passed, making school attendance optional. ensuring that black children could be kept home during harvest seasons. Even when schools did survive, they were underfunded, overcrowded, and supplied with the cast-off materials from white schools, torn books, broken desks, and no heating in winter. Still, parents sent their children in rags and bare feet, walking miles through hostile territory, because knowledge was the one inheritance they could fight to give. Each child who learned to read became a seed for future resistance. But the war on education was relentless, stretching far beyond Reconstruction, ensuring that the ladder upward was missing most of its rungs. The justice system, newly freed from the responsibility of enforcing slave codes, quickly reinvented itself as the enforcer of racial order. Black codes, passed in state after state, criminalized everyday life for freedmen. Unemployment could be punished with arrest for vagrancy. Speaking too loudly to a white person could be deemed disturbing the peace. Once arrested, the accused faced trials in courts presided over by white judges, with all white juries delivering predictable verdicts. The punishment? Fines that could not be paid, leading to a new system, convict leasing. Under convict leasing, prisoners were rented out to private businesses, railroads, and plantations, often under worse conditions than slavery itself. There were no incentives to keep the leased prisoners alive. If one died, another could be procured from the courts. This system became a pipeline, police, courts, and industry working together to create a renewable source of free labor. It blurred the line between freedom and bondage so completely that in some counties, more black men were in forced labor after emancipation than before. The prisons filled, the fields stayed worked, and the state profited from every body it could chain under the guise of law. The 13th Amendment had a loophole. Slavery was banned, except as punishment for a crime. That single line kept the system alive. Over time, the memory of slavery's true brutality was softened in public discourse, replaced with a more polite history. Textbooks painted slavery as a regrettable but benign institution, downplaying its violence and erasing the resistance of the enslaved. The narrative shifted from chains and blood to smiling field hands and kind masters. This rewriting wasn't just ignorance, it was deliberate. A people robbed of their true history are easier to control. Generations of white children were taught that the Civil War was about states' rights rather than human bondage, while generations of black children were denied the tools to see through the myth. Monuments to Confederate leaders rose in town squares, casting stone shadows over communities still recovering from the wounds those men had inflicted. In the North, the myth of a completed freedom allowed citizens to ignore the ongoing oppression in the South. It was a perfect erasure. The crime was acknowledged in vague terms, the victims honored in abstract, and the perpetrators recast as tragic heroes. Without truth, justice becomes impossible. Without memory, cycles repeat. By the turn of the century, the machinery was complete. Political disenfranchisement, economic exploitation, legal re-enslavement, educational suppression, and cultural erasure worked together as a single organism. The South looked different on paper, but in practice, it was a continuation of the old order with new vocabulary. Jim Crow laws cemented segregation, ensuring that every public space reminded the black population of their assigned place. Signs over fountains, entrances, and restrooms didn't just separate, they humiliated. The architecture of oppression became mundane, woven into the rhythm of daily life so completely that many no longer questioned it. This normalization was the final victory of the old system, to make injustice seem natural. People born into this structure accepted it as the way things had always been. The plantations had been replaced by factories, the overseers by police, the whip by the threat of prison. But the hierarchy remained. Freedom, once promised, had been turned into a hollow word, something to point to in speeches while denying it in practice. The greatest trick of the post-emancipation order was convincing the world that the story was over. Photographs of smiling freedmen, parades on Emancipation Day, and staged portraits of black politicians in office created an image of progress that masked the reality beneath. Outside observers, even those in the North, saw only the surface and assumed the problem had been solved. Meanwhile, the people living under the shadow of the old system learned a different truth. Freedom is not given once. It must be defended daily. Each generation had to fight the same battles, in different forms, against opponents who had simply changed their uniforms and their laws. This is why the myth of instant liberation is so dangerous. It blinds us to the ways oppression adapts. The plantation was not a place. It was a blueprint. And as long as that blueprint remains unchallenged, it can be rebuilt anywhere, in any era, with different walls, but the same locked doors. The story does not end with emancipation. It ends only when the machinery itself is dismantled, piece by piece, until no master can claim ownership over another's future. That day has not yet come.